And Joanne and I saw atrocities. You cannot believe they started the genocide of blacks in Libya the first week of this phony revolution. We saw mass graves.
They were open about it. There were articles in the paper about how they were going to cleanse Libya.
But we saw ourselves about a half a dozen mass graves. These pits were probably 30-foot wide, 50-foot long, full of black bodies. We saw half a dozen of them. The total count of those mass graves was about 128 in Libya. We took photos of that. We tried to get Farrakhan. We tried to get all the black leaders in the United States, Al Sharpton, all of them, to do something about this. None of them wanted to none of them would hear a thing about it. There was never any support against the genocide in Libya, and that was a real tragedy because before that, Libya was a colorblind country. About a third of the Libyan citizens were black, and they held first-class passports. There were 3 classes of passports in Libya. And in every family, you saw every shade from black to beige in all families. And that was one of the things we liked about Libya, because you did not have any kind of race conflict going on.
The lie, if you remember, the lie that Gaddafi was bringing in black mercenaries from Africa to fight against the Libyan people was a lie, and this was their excuse for killing all these black people. This is what they used. It was a real atrocity. We were at Sarman when they blew up a compound full of a home of people with laser guided missiles, just a home of a man and his family, pregnant women, children. 15 people were killed. The cordite was still in the air. We could still smell it when we were there. We have pictures of the bomb. We have pictures of the ID number on the bomb. We know exactly.
It was U.S. made.
It was U.S. made weapons. It was Canada who was bombing, and it was a laser target on a family home. And the man who survived, a couple of them who survived, stood there with tears running down their eyes, begging us to go into the mortuary and take pictures of the dead children and the dead bodies, and put it out to the media, because he said no one will report this. And so we did it, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. In my report, I gave it to Press TV, and those pictures still go around, are all around the world, of that dead little baby and the other people who were killed in that bombing raid.
Now, Libya was not a perfect place. Libya had a real problem. There were a bunch of Khazarian mafia that claimed to have been Jews that moved into Misrata about 150 years ago. And they were thugs. They were absolute mafia. And they were the ones that would confront everybody aggressively. Libyans are the most non-confrontational.
Oh, Hans-Christian Andersson, du redest von Wert. Der wahre Wert ist Zeit. Und davon raubst du mir gerade welche. Du willst Deutschland retten. Wir sind schon fertig. Komm zum Punkt und laber nicht dumm rum, früher morgen. Alter Schwede.
People we've ever met in our lives, they won't fight about anything. Their tribal law is that, let's say you ran into my car. We would shake hands and forgive each other, and you would owe me a favor. And next year I said, my daughter's getting married. I want you to supply the food for the wedding. You would do that. And if you didn't do it, then your family was obliged to do it. And if your family didn't do it, then your tribe had to do it. And that was agreed to on the spot. And if we couldn't agree to that, then they would put both of us in jail and feed us gruel and camel's milk until we agreed to that. That was their justice system.
They have an 8,000-year-old culture.
And so when the Misrata Mafia moved in there, they acted like they were Muslims. They built underground mosques, and actually they had underground weapons production facilities, because nobody in Libya had any weapons. One of the ranking ministers had a Chinese-made air rifle. That was the only weapon he had. So people in Libya did not have weapons, period. They didn't have any.
A Chinese-made air rifle.
Yeah. And
it wasn't very good.
It wasn't very good. You know, he used to shoot rabbits on his farm. But you know, the Libyan people had no weapons. And the police were not armed. In a city the size of Tripoli, 2 million people, we saw 3 police. There were not any traffic lights. I mean,
Habt ihr das gehört? 3 Polizisten unbewaffnet in Libyen unter Gaddafi. Respekt.
You know, it was
It
crazy.
was
but
much safer than Chicago or any place, or Houston, any place you can imagine. You could go out at night, nobody would bother anybody.
But the problem was Misrata Mafia. Misrata was the only modern city in Libya, and that was the only port facility that would handle containers, and it would handle a 100,000 ton container, one a day. So not really a very big port. But all of the goods and services, ingress and egress into Libya went through Misrata. And not only that, but the Misrata thugs got 60% of all the Libyan government contracts without bid or tender. And Libya was a really unique place because any contract that the government side already had to have the money in the bank to pay for it before they could sign it. So anybody that signed a contract in Libya, it was gold because the money was already there. And what the Misrata Mafia did is they sublet these contracts to foreign builders and then would chisel them on payments. And there'd be change orders and they wouldn't pay them for that. And so a lot of the major contracts, there were 150 projects abandoned in Libya by the foreign contractors owned by the Misrata Mafia. Then they would recontract them to another group and start the process over again. They were absolutely thieves. There was a building about 10 miles west of Tripoli, real nice 10-story building, separated from everything else. And we were going by and I'd seen that building several times. And I said, what is that building over there? And our friend said, well, that's Alibaba's building. And I said, Alibaba. He said, you know, the story Alibaba and the thieves. He said, that's where the Alibaba and all the thieves live. And I said, who is that? And he said, oh, that's the Misrata tribe. And so they did have a problem. And actually they had done a Bernie Madoff kind of a theft of Libya for a huge sum, billions of dollars. And some young, bright IT guys had found this, that the securities that these guys were delivering to Libya were phony. And so the Libyan government was about to take down the Misrata Mafia and confiscate all their assets, which included the biggest oil field service company in Libya, a lot of production companies, businesses all over. And mysteriously enough, that's who Hillary joined hands with to take down Libya. So, you know, the problem, first of all, was the African bank. That was the main reason Libya had to be taken down, because the Zionist bankers could not allow any upstart company or country like Libya to destroy their fiat banking system. Second, the United States wanted to affect AFRICOM, which is the military control of Africa. There were 7 countries in Africa that did not agree to it: Libya, South Africa, and 5 others. After Libya fell, of course, they immediately succumbed, and so did the rest of the countries. So AFRICOM became a reality for the U.S. The third reason was all the exploitation of all the African countries by the Europeans had been going on for hundreds of years. Every treaty that was ever signed with any country in Africa was never honored. There were never any payments made. There were bribes made to officials, but the treaties were not honored. And so Gaddafi was a big African Union guy. In fact, he was the first president of the African Union. And so after he retired or resigned as the leader of Libya, he formed a coalition and had started an action against all the European countries for the failed treaty agreements in Africa. And the lawsuit was up to about $7 trillion. It had been presented to World Court, and the attorney said that lawsuit had legs. In other words, it had a very high probability of winning. And of course, England and France and Italy, none of these guys had any money anyhow, so they could not afford to be obligated for $7 trillion. So this is another reason why they joined hands with Hillary. And Hillary is called the butcher of Libya by the Libyan people. So these other countries joined hands with her. And they didn't do it willingly. When Tripoli had been invaded by the mercenaries, our hotel, which was the Corinthia Hotel, a real nice 6-star hotel, a few of the ambassadors moved to that hotel because that's the only hotel that had enough food stocks and power plants and everything to keep operating. And one of them was the plenipotentiary ambassador from South Africa. His name was H.E. Dangor. And we had tea with him a couple of times. And one day Joanne asked him, she said, why in the world did South Africa join hands
against Gaddafi.
You all had such good working relationships. He said, we had no choice. He said, your Secretary of State showed up in our country and said if we didn't join hands with her against Libya, that we would have rebels in our backyard. He said it was like the woman had a closet full of rebels she could drop down any place. Well, she did have. That was these Al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood mercenaries that she could put any place she needed to.
Fomenting revolutions has been a long history for them to destabilize countries in the world, for the cabal, Zionists, whatever you want to call them.
Alter Schwede, ich habe dir gerade ein Video reingepostet, das geht eine Stunde. Und nach 5 Minuten sagst du schon, du siehst nie, wo die Lösung ist. Wie wär's mal mit Video angucken? Wie wär's mal mit angucken? Nee, ist natürlich unvorstellbar. Kleiner Tipp, ich mache jetzt was Produktives und rette weiterhin den Rest der Welt. Deutschland ist ja schon gerettet. Während ihr weiterhin hofft, dass hier irgendwas passiert, während ihr sitzt. Viel Spaß.
You remember we'd had a long time friendly working relationship with Egypt. After Nasser fell, the next government there was friendly to the United States. Mubarak had been a real good friend of the U.S. forever. And he was overthrown, and put in his place was Muslim Brotherhood, a guy named Morsi. Morsi and Morsi's wife were 30-year friends of the Clintons and best friends with Barack Obama. So they installed next door to Libya the Muslim Brotherhood. And incidentally, while Morsi was there, Obama gave Morsi $8 billion.
Nein, ich bin in einer Gruppe, wo es um die Frage Deutschlands geht und wie man die Probleme abarbeitet. Ich biete euch die Lösung an, ihr wollt sie nicht hören. Das ist das Problem. Und dann diskutiert ihr noch eine halbe Stunde rum, anstatt einfach mal die Lösung anzuhören. Aber ihr wollt gar nicht, weil wenn es gelöst ist, habt ihr morgen nichts mehr zu tun. Dann müsst ihr wieder mit eurer Frau reden. OMG. Kennst du die eine Gruppe mit 5000 Patrioten, die Deutschland retten wollen? Seit 5 Jahren reden sie drüber. Passiert ist bisher nichts. Ich tippe mal, du bist einer von denen.
By half the Sinai Peninsula, so the Muslim Brotherhood would have a homeland. Those documents were found in his safe after he was overthrown by a popular uprising of the people of Egypt.
Hillary Clinton also gave leaders of Muslim Brotherhood through her embassy in Egypt during the time she was Secretary of State anywhere from $300,000 to $800,000 in cash to Muslim Brotherhood leaders. And there's proof of that reported by Dr. Jerome Corsi with the document we gave him where these leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic terrorist group Muslim Brotherhood, came in and signed for the money in the U.S. Embassy. And that was also found in Morsi's safe and was leaked out by the tribes to us. Those men were tried for treason in Egypt for taking money from a foreign country, and most of them are sentenced to death now.
5 of them sentenced to death, the rest of them life in prison without parole.
But how does the State Department explain, and how does Hillary Clinton explain? Because no one has ever asked her giving cash to Muslim Brotherhood.
$850,000 is a hell of a lot of money. And the reason our information is credible is that, as I said, we're not really political activists or anything. We became friendly with the tribes because we actually ended up signing contracts with them in Libya. We got to know all of them real well, and we treated them with respect. And
well, let me explain something. In Libya, everybody's a member of a tribe. The tribes go back 8,000 years, and most people identify each other by what tribe they're in. They know, foreigners don't have a clue who's in what tribe. But in the Libyan government, which was a pure democracy, you had the People's House of Representatives, which were voted in, and then you had the General Secretariat of the tribes, 250 members representing every tribe, and they actually were the shadow government overseeing the People's House of Representatives. If they did anything against the people, they could veto people, they could have people thrown out of office. So they had 2 houses, and they had a direct democracy, or a republic, if you will. They had a direct one because the people in anybody's tribe could go to their tribal leaders who they knew very well and complain if something was wrong. And those tribal leaders could take it to the General Secretariat and could take it to the government or do something themselves with it. And it's always been that way in Libya. So now they have no government. They have a failed state. They do have a House of Representatives that was elected, but it had to move to Tobruk because they were attacked by the Muslim Brotherhood, Ansar al-Sharia, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever you want to call them, people that are puppet government trying to stay in power by Hillary Clinton. You also still have the General Secretariat of the Tribes. It doesn't have a house there in Tobruk because it's dangerous for them, but they do know each other. They are in contact all the time, and they still make decisions for the country.
The tribes they asked us if we would please help them get the information about what was going on. And Dr. Jerome Corsi has written more than 40.
So, das hören wir später in Ruhe an. Wir hören uns erstmal wieder das an.
This idea that the evolution of mankind will end in this final equilibrium of this pure divine spirit in the material world. And so when you think about all of the equality in the world, that's really just an allegory for occultism. So when you see like the equal sign for like an LGBT movement, that's like one of their marks of their version of God for how this all works. It ends in equilibrium. And so of course,
Marriage equality.
yeah. So the idea of equilibrium is tied to, the astrotheological ideas of all deities are equal when you view them in the esoteric light. So Krishna, Christ, Osiris, they're all the same once you apply the esoteric doctrines to them. And obviously that's in contradistinction to Orthodox Christianity where Christ is the only God, right? So bringing all things to an equilibrium, and then you think about Lucifer in the Old Testament, wanting to rise up and be equal to God, ascend to the recesses of the north and things like that. So that's sort of like the dichotomy. So their infinite deity is called light, and that's like the Gnostic gnosis. You receive the true light or the true understanding of God. And really this all ties into science and the God of Spinoza. Blavatsky seems to have a lot of praise for Baruch Spinoza. And so you'll hear quotes from I think it's Carl Sagan's son said, "My father believed in the God of Spinoza and Einstein." And it's all this impersonal understanding with the laws of nature and all this kind of stuff. So really science is the occult. And that's what I go through in my occult science series. So that's something people can look into if they'd like. So that's kind of like their version of it. It's all very abstract and it's, it's based on evolution. And then the devil of occultism. So if you look at a tarot card of the devil, this is like a hieroglyph for what they think is holding humanity back. So this occult devil is a personal creator god or deity, an anthropomorphized god, and also pure atheism and materialism. Now, one thing that's confused, or Blavatsky kind of complains about a lot, is that people mistake the occult doctrines for being atheistic and materialistic. And this is part of people's ignorance. They just don't understand how sophisticated it is, right? This is sort of what you get when you read these doctrines. So, and she says that a lot of their doctrines tied to Hinduism and Eastern religion and stuff like that. So that's sort of where they're coming from. So the devil is ignorance, superstition, bondage, and slavery. But this would be best represented in, traditional Catholic Christianity. That's like their supreme symbol of ignorance and superstition. So, the quote unquote dark ages, as they call them, that's like that makes them very emotional when they start writing about it. And so this darkness is part of the alchemical transformation process. So part of a ritual in occultism is to kill off this ignorance or this lead of exoteric Christianity, as they would call it, or any version of Judaism that's tied to a personal God or whatever, anything like that, or being overly atheistic. And then you go through this process. It's supposed to be this horrifying, destructive process that is related to the psychological nature of realizing all of your old paradigms have been shattered by this Luciferian gnosis or light, and then you're reborn. And they use John 3:3, reborn to see the kingdom of God. That kind of idea, that's their understanding, their Gnostic interpretation of the Gospel of John, Book of Revelation, all this stuff. They will all be tied to this process of an initiate going through trials and tribulations. So that's like the allegory for it. So that's kind of the distinction here. So whenever you hear Satan or the devil, from the occult perspective, it's essentially Catholic Christianity. And I'll read a couple quotes real quick to kind of...
Das ist jetzt wichtig zu verstehen. Die Satanisten sagen, die Katholiken sind die Bösen, weil sie glauben an den normalen Gott. Sie glauben nicht an den wahren Gott, sie glauben an den Schöpfergott. Aber der ultimate, real, fat shit Gott ist ja der vom Ende des Universums, das Schleiermonster, das Rauchmonster, das Uhrwerk. Das ist der wahre Gott für sie. In der Mathematik der Perfektionen. Nicht so ein vermenschlichter Gott wie Jesus oder Jahwe oder Moses, Mohammed, langweilig. Aber Robogott oder die Galaktische Union, das sind dann die Götter, auf die die Gnosis hinwollen. Logisch. Auf der Quantenebene, sagen sie. Auf der Quantenebene. Kannst du es beweisen? Nee. Musst du glauben? Ja, genau. Wow. Du glaubst an Gott oder du glaubst an die Quantenebene? Aber auf der Quantenebene gibt es keine Moral. Bei Gott schon. Christentum, katholisches Christentum, ist das Einzige, was in Gut und Böse unterscheidet. Alle anderen Religionen nicht. Deswegen kommt auch von uns die Offenbarung 666 und dann das Inferno. Wir haben doch gesagt, da stimmt was nicht. Und alle anderen bloß sagten, ja, wieder ein normaler Tag, wie immer in der Sklaverei. Wir wussten Freiheit, richtig, falsch, gut, böse, Moral, etc. Das ist der entscheidende Faktor. Nächstenliebe, moralisch, ja, etc. Das Wort Ich versus wir. Die sagen, wir Bewusstsein, sagen eigentlich immer ich. Sie meinen den Burg-Kubus. Wir sind die Burg. Andere Meinung gibt es nicht. Ja, ein Kubus, ein Würfel, ein Black Cube, eine Impfung, ein Golem und ein Schleiermonster am Ende des Universums, was sagt, ich bin auf jeden Fall der Gute. Deswegen bin ich am Ende, dort wo keiner hingeht, lebt er. Dort wo das Klo ist, quasi wo es stinkt. Und der ist vertrauenswürdig, weil ein Crowley und eine Blavatsky das gesagt haben. Dieses Licht, was Sie sehen, sind Luzifers Eier. Das ist wichtig. In der Gnosis wirst du wiedergeboren nach einer Prozessalchemie. Und in jedem Teil des Prozesses erkennst du dich selber nicht wieder. Du stößt Teile von dir ab, mit denen du nicht zufrieden bist. Um am Ende purer Geist zu sein. Ohne Körper. Es geht auch schneller. Spring aus dem Fenster. Ist auch bloß ein Prozess. Ist weder gut noch schlecht. Es macht nur Bumm. Aber es beginnt ja auch wieder neu. Wenn du an Wiedergeburt glaubst, natürlich. Ist bloß blöd bei Generation Z im Reagenzglas. Also, was haben alle Religionen falsch gemacht und warum gab es das Update von Jesus? Was passiert mit dem Judentum nach der Apokalypse, wenn ihr Messias da ist? Weil unsere war ja schon da. Jetzt kommt ihre. Und dann ist vorbei mit Zionismus. Der Zionismus ist tot, wenn der Messias da ist. Nie wieder Judenhass. Das wollen die Deutschen den ganzen Tag machen. So, wie schreiben wir das jetzt auf? Kein Plan.
Hammer home this point because I think that it's pretty important, especially with a lot of things that go on in the truth of the world today. I hear people talk about, the Jesuits are the rulers of evil, or it's the Jews, or it's this or that, and it's just kind of, we get this all-encompassing label, and I think it's a lot more complex than that. You have to kind of define the attributes of the terms of what one of these so-called groups would believe, and so this might give a little bit of background as to what the occultists might believe. So this is taken from Isis Unveiled, Volume 2, and this is from Chapter 8. And this whole Chapter 8 is about the Templars and the Jesuits being in combat with each other. And what is a true Templar to Blavatsky and what is a fake Templar? Or what is a true Freemason? What's a fake Freemason?
Und jetzt wird's ja geil. Ne? Wir haben die Jesuiten, wir haben die Masonic und die Templer. Wir haben Real und Fake, ne? Und Fake Masonics und Real und Fake Templer. Das Ziel der Freimaurer war von 1717 an, die Kirche zu vernichten, haben sie geschafft 1871. 1871 zog der Jesuit aus dem Vatikan aus, infiltrierte die Freimaurer und gründete das Level 33. Die Illuminaten waren geboren. Also, die Freimaurer bekämpfen den Vatikan. Vatikan verliert, Jesuiten infiltrieren Freimaurer, lassen dann die Freimaurer für sich kämpfen und sagen, der wahre Feind sind doch die Geistlichen und Katholiken. Eigentlich war der Vatikan das Problem, dann war er aber besiegt. Die Illuminaten im 33. Level infiltrierten die Freimaurer, speziell die British und die Grand Orient Lodge in Frankreich. Über diese beiden Strömungen, 1 und 2, versuchte man dann Strömung 3 in Deutschland sowie Strömung 4 in Russland zu beeinflussen. Was ja logisch ist, weil 1971 der Vatikan II kam und die P2 Lodge des Teufels Beste, die dann als 5. Loge im Spiel, kommt ihr noch mit, wenn jetzt noch 2 Twin Towers, 2 Pillar der Freimaurerei darstellen, 2 verschiedene, und eine Freiheitsstatue dazwischen gezeichnet ist, dann ist es der unsichtbare 3. Pillar, der die Harmonie zwischen beiden anderen Pillern bringt. Laut Legende der Freimaurerei. Wenn jetzt aber beide Türme gekickt werden, heißt das, der Teufel erklärt beiden Seiten den Krieg. Jesuiten, Freimaurer und Templer, weiß und schwarz. Die von unten aus Ägypten, Babylonien und die von oben aus Atlantis. Und die Templer, die wussten, wie es wirklich war. Aber die Templer brannten ja 1307, damit der Vatikan 1313 dann den Bullen machen konnte, um eure Seelen zu rauben. Was dann dazu führte, dass Dante ein Inferno schrieb, was 700 Jahre später zur letzten Schlacht der Menschheit führt. 700 Jahre, 1300 plus 700 Jahre sind wir irgendwann bei 2000. 1971 kam Great Reset, Anti-Baby-Pille, Lucifer Rising, Abtreibung, Deep Throat, Porno, Schulmädchenreport, Hotpan und, Vatikan II und, plus die Klimaagenda und alle Agendas haben damals gestartet. Mit Kombination P2. Die englische war infiltriert, die französische auch, die deutsche war niedergeschlagen, die russische war weg. Es waren nur noch 25 Ritter. 25 Ritter aus Dresden, ja, die dann 2010 mit einem deutschen Papst und 25 Ritter, One German Pope, versuchten, diese Schlacht irgendwie zu gewinnen und haben 2013 das Gesetz von 1313 zurückgesetzt über den Vatikan-Bullen, also es zurückgelegt. Somit kam 2014 dann, nach 200 Jahren, der erste schwarze Papst, der Jesuitenpapst, der Black Pope. Warum? Das Recht über die Seelen hat er verloren. Er musste agieren. Wir haben ihn gezwungen in die Action rein. Wenn man jetzt noch weiß, dass eine Eternal Flame, eine ewige Flamme, in Dallas brennt, wo eine Armee, die sich die Black Knights nennen, also die schwarzen Ritter, mit einem Ziegenbock als Maskottchen in Kombination mit einer Speerspitze namens Donald J. Trump, der Vorbereiter, ja, und dem Ausführer, weil im Judentum gibt es einen Vorbereiter, bin David und bin Moses hier, also der eine beide vor und der andere führt es dann aus, Trump und Kennedy, die mit dem Bock, der Boxsager, die Pandora-Box öffnen mit der Armee von Dallas, mit der Eternal Flame, Die Flamme, die so lange brennt, bis das Ganze gerecht ist. Was passierte und die letzte Schlacht vorbei ist, wenn der schwarze Papst nach 200 Jahren Jesuiten plus Illuminaten automatisch Code 666, weil das sind 6 Jahre bis zum Great Reset 2020. Also Code 666 plus 6 Jahre führt zu 2020. Noch ein Jahr drauf sind wir von 1971 zu 2021. 50 Jahre, passt perfekt. Check. (1871) hat man gewonnen. 1971 kam Vatikan II. Das war jetzt der Green Vatikan, der Klima-Vatikan, der dann automatisch zur Greta führt. No? We gonna dance like Greta like that. Wir dancen Greta when Greta. Wir müssen jetzt einen Trendsport draus machen über den Grete-Tanz. Dass jeder so dumm tanzt wie die Grete, sodass jeder sie auslacht. You wanna dance like Greta dance. Ja, was er dann mit dem nächsten Lied, diesem Verhaltensstörung. Du lässt einfach bescheuerte Kinder draußen rumrennen, die gegen Dinger laufen und hinfallen und singst dazu 5 Spritzen nochmal, Verhaltensstörung. Freitags auf der Straße. Ich komme vom Thema ab. Zurück zur Freimaurerei und zu rituellen alchemistischen Prozessen. Jesuiten infiltrieren Maurer. Gründen Level 33. Von 32 im Schottischen bis runter, die fragen ja nie nach, was oben im 33. beim Pipi- und Pupu-Ritual ist. Die 2 Pillar der Freimaurerei haben eine dritte jetzt dazwischen, die den Einklang bringt zwischen beiden. Nennen wir sie doch mal die 2 Wikinger, die Schwarz- und die Blondkopfs. Der eine aus Äthiopien, der andere von hier. Beide tragen die Rune, kommen aus Atlantis und haben die Bockspur in sich. Der jüdische Stern plus das deutsche Schwert. Ja? Der Michel. Nur beide gemeinsam haben das Glück, Drache plus Bulle plus Teufel zu kicken. Ja? Nur wir. Dafür sind wir doch geboren, wir Deutschen. Teufel, Drache und Vatikanbulle gleichzeitig kicken, ohne dabei die Welt in Flammen zu setzen. Yes, we can. Wir sind doch Deutschland. Wer bin ich wir? Gut, die letzten 2 Mal ging es jetzt nicht ganz so rund, aber ist erstmal egal. Ja. Die Frau hat auch erst beim 3. Mal kochen gekonnt. Also Templer, Maurer und Jesuiten. Und der Heilige Orden zu Jerusalem mit den 25 Rittern, die ja dann in Dresden starteten und den Papst agieren ließen, der die Gebeine des Kaisers nach Berlin zurück verlegen ließ und alles das vorbereitete im Kampf gegen die Bösen. Also die 25 Ritter aus Dresden, die paar restlichen Templer aus dem Kaninchenbau, die schottischen Templer speziell und die Freimaurer, die endlich gecheckt haben, dass sie gefickt werden. Was ja, die Freimaurer hatten 1871 ihr Ziel erreicht. Die wollten den Vatikan stürzen. Für die Pisas da draußen, Vatikan II ist der neue Vatikan. Die Freimaurer wollten ihn stürzen. Als sie ihn gestürzt hatten, kamen die Jesuiten zu den Freimaurern rein und haben über die Freimaurer mehr Schwachsinn gemacht, um jetzt den Vatikan II zu gründen. Während sie noch die Lodge infiltriert haben und alles andere. Ich werde das Ganze irgendwann mal unter dem Thema die Clown World Order. Die Clowns in Action, die CIA. Alles, was ihr seht, ist Schwachsinn. Stellt euch einen Clown vor mit rotem Mund und großen Schuhen und dann guckt Nachrichten und was sie erzählen. Und dann versteht ihr es. Es ist die Clown World Order. Jedes Kind versteht, dass das ein Clown ist. Die meisten Deutschen haben noch nie einen Clown gesehen. Ich kenne nur S. Und S kannst du töten. Es ist nicht mehr er oder sie, es ist S. Das kann weg. Es ist kein Mensch mehr. Nicht mal eine Person. Es ist, ach so, Tier. Irgendwie. Egal. Die Analyse des Ganzen ist wirklich faszinierend. Weil wenn du die Templerverbrennung 1313 reinnimmst, die Templar Purge und Dantes Inferno mit den 200 Jahren der Illuminaten und der Schlacht des X-Clubs, das Prometheus-Protokoll und dann Schöpfer sein Produkt zu zerstören, was dann zu einem Golem führt, ne? Der Spitze der Pyramide, das allsehende Auge, eine künstliche Intelligenz, die euch die ganze Zeit beobachtet, plus die Kreta-Gebote in der Earth Charta, ne? Earth Charta, die 19 Gebote der Illuminaten. Im Arbeiterparadies, wo du jeden Tag arbeiten gehen darfst, im Homeoffice, kriegst sogar bedingungsloses Grundeinkommen. 3 Stück Brot am Tag. Ihr wolltet ein Arbeiterparadies bei der SPD? Ihr wolltet bedingungsloses Grundeinkommen? Ihr habt bloß nie gedacht, dass es Homeoffice ist. Das ist das Arbeiterparadies, kannst du halt arbeiten. Jeden Tag, lebenslang. Und wenn du nicht, dann Credit Minus. Freitags auf der Straße haben sie sich das doch schon ausgemacht. PS, aktuell ist da draußen ein schwarzes Loch. Das frisst Sonnen. Da müssen wir eine Demo machen, nicht dass der unsere Sonne frisst. Es kommt Meldung zur Zeit. Schwarzes Loch frisst Sonnen. Jeden Tag eine. Bald ist dunkel. Das ist so geil.
So anytime there's a fake Templar or fake Freemason, she ties it to the Jesuits and their so-called corruption of the mystery tradition. So this is from pages 377 through 378, and she's quoting Albert Pike to basically set straight how the mystery religion views things. So Albert Pike says, this principal creator is no new phrase, but an old term revived. He says, our adversaries, numerous and formidable, will say, and will have the right to say, that our principal creator is identical with the principal generator of the Indians and the Egyptians, and may be fitly symbolized as it was symbolized anciently by the Linge, or this is the Shiva Lingam.
Ja, aber dann würde ich zu Albert Pike sagen, aber lieber Herr Pike, diese ägyptischen Mystikschulen gab es doch nie. Da ist eine Wikingerrune an der Sphinx, die umgestaltet wurde. Dann würde Albert Pike sagen, Und dann würde ich sagen, die indogermanischen Runen, da unten bis nach Thailand ran, kommen auch von hier. Es kommt doch alles von hier, Herr Pike. Und dann würde er mit Inkas und Mayas anfangen, dann sagt ich, aber die Rune war doch auch da. Alle Religionen kamen von hier oben. Alle Inspirationen. Wir haben das Paganentum erschaffen, ja. Aber danach haben wir Jesus geschickt, den Updater, der das 2.0 erschuf. Nicht mehr Hippie sein, sondern Hippie mit Moral. Das ist wichtig. Moral. Weil sonst frisst du kleine Kinder und fickst sie noch davor. Und sagst, ja mei, ist halt Freitag. Das ist ein kleiner schwerer Unterschied. Was glaubt ihr, von Dresden bombardiert wurde und Nagasaki? Weil sie katholisch sind. Und sie die einzigen sind, die dem Teufel entgegenstehen. Der ganze Hippie-Shit wurde eingeführt für euch. Nur um euch daran zu hindern, Widerstand zu leisten. Und dann bekam der auch links und die anderen bekamen rechts. Dann sagt ihr Rüpel, ich sag Hippie. Aber im Endeffekt, wenn man die Ideen der Hippies nützt und rüpelig umsetzt, dann hast du es verstanden. Wenn du aber Hippie bist und einfach die Schuhe nie anziehst und nie aufstehst und nur im Geist bist, dann ist klar. Du bist im Geist, ich pupst dich ein. Ich klatsche noch eine. Tat nie weh, oder? Bist doch nur im Geist. Wie jetzt? Bist du doch nicht? Glaubst nicht an deine eigene Religion? Ist doch nur Flux. Ha! Und noch ein Kick in die Fresse rein. Flux, bam, Flux, bam. Und jetzt erklären wir mal, dass du noch im Geist bist. Mit the power of your mind. Kugel ins Bein, ab in See. Wir sehen uns morgen. Oder glaubst du nicht an deine Religion? Und es ist ja alles nur Flux, ist ja nur ein Prozess. Ob ich dich nur jetzt unbox oder dann, ist vollkommen egal. Irgendwann stirbst du sowieso. Flux. The indische way of life. Ja. Der Brite hat immer gegen die gewonnen. Das einzige Volk, was Widerstand leistet, sind wir seit 1000 Jahren. Weil wir diese Religion haben. Weil wir sagen, bis hierhin und nicht weiter. Jetzt reicht's. Mir geht's nur gut, wenn es meinem Nachbarn gut geht. Dann sind wir alle gleich. Alles, was nach dem Tod von Jesus Und nachdem Nietzsche Gott getötet hat, waren die Ismen und die Hippie-Religion, was alles Abweichungen vom Original sind. Das Original war Jesus. Davor war es das Judending. Er war der König der Juden. Er war der König, er war nie einfach der Handwerker oder der Klempner, der Gärtner. Nee, er war der König der Juden. Und wir machten den Bock zum Gärtner. Natürlich. Er wusste doch, wie die Natur leben kann. Der Herr Bock brachte das Wissen doch mit. Deswegen haben wir doch den Bock zum Gärtner gemacht. Um die Natur in seiner vollen Pracht zu erschaffen. Aber auch zu bedenken, dass es kein Geschenk ist. Dass es nicht selbstverständlich ist. Dass man im Einklang mit der Natur leben muss. Aber auch moralisch sagen, nur weil du Löwe bist und jetzt hier ein Reh frisst, ist das nicht böse. Aber du hast keinen Bausparvertrag. Hast du ein Auto, hast du Haus, hast du Kinder, hast du eine Frau in Scheidung mit Anwalt und so? Nee, du bist Löwe. Ich bin Mensch. Wieso gelten Löwenregeln? Weil ist ja nicht böse, wenn der Löwe das macht. Und der Vulkan ist auch nicht böse, wenn er das macht. Ja, aber hat der einen Bausparvertrag? Nee, hat er nicht. Hat der ein Haus? Nee. Also, Hippie-Logiken sind so geil. Verwirrend. Du kannst das von dort nehmen mit dem, was gar nicht zusammengehört und das kombinieren mit dem. Und dann einfach dran glauben auf der Quantenebene. Niemals Widerstand. 100 Hippies gleichzeitig aus dem Yoga-Studio rausschieben. Ohne Gegenwehr. Nein. Das sind Hippies. Seit 1970 wollen sie die Welt verändern. Wie weit sind sie gekommen? Ach, bis zur Haustür. Ja? Also, dieses ganze Ding, dieses The Devil's Trick, dieses gezielte, koordinierte Lügen, wenn du alle 100 Jahre minimal veränderst und die Dinge so verdrehst, dann brauchst du nichts erschaffen. Durch die Verwirrung kloppen sich alle gegenseitig um. Das ist der Trick des Teufels. Ein bisschen hier, ein bisschen da, we trust in God, we trust in Gold. Dort ein Buchstabe raus, dort eine Zahl davor, dort eine Karte gedreht. Und plötzlich kloppen sich alle gegenseitig um. Und denken, sie wären das Problem. Dabei ist dort einer mit kurzem Penis, der die ganze Zeit Unfug treibt. Ja. Es kann nur ein Penisneid sein.
To accept this in lieu of a personal God is to abandon Christianity and the worship of Jehovah and return to wallow in the styles of paganism. So basically what he's saying is that the worship of a personal God tied to Christianity, that's the opposite of occultism. And their principal creator, whenever they talk about the creator, it's in the context of the Egyptian mystery schools and the Indian Hindus and Brahmins. And so there you go right there. He's saying that get rid of that old.
Na, also wir haben Jesus und Jehovah oder Jahwe, wie sie ihn nennen. Die persönlichen Götter, die auf diesem Planeten lebenden, für uns Götter. Und es gibt den Creator, den Ingenieur, das Rauchmonster. Die Rauchwolke am Ende des Universums. Rauchwolken. Wie eine Uhr, die tickt und takt, wo die Mathematik die heiligste Form ist. Mathematik plus Wissenschaft. Ja, das ist ja die ägyptische, aus der ägyptischen Schule, die es ja niemals gab. Das dachten die in Griechenland, dass es sowas gab, gab es aber nicht. Sie waren dumm. Sie hatten sich gehört. Und seitdem glauben immer noch die Leute, dass es das mal da in Ägypten gab. Aber nee, das Ägypten kam aus Sudan und Sudan kam aus Äthiopien. Und Äthiopien kam von der Wikingerrune von hier oben raus. Direkt aus Atlantis. Immer wieder dasselbe. Aber sie waren dumm, sie waren Pisa, sie wussten nichts, es gab kein Internet und auch nicht mich. Daher gab es auch Krieg. Das ist ganz einfach. Du musst die Schlüpfer der Frau bis zum Ende aufklappen, um zu wissen, wo der Anfang der Geschichte ist. Schlechtes Beispiel, aber ich glaube, ihr wisst, was ich meine. Nur Zeitgeist zu gucken oder zu sagen, alle Religionen sind gleich. Genau. Du weißt das besser als all die, die Religion leben. Du bist ja ziemlich verrückt, zu glauben, dass du es besser weißt als 7 Milliarden, die das leben. Weil du jetzt hier ein Buch gelesen hast. Ha! Ja, das ist dieser Hochmut. Wenn man das Ego abstößt und glaubt, dass man besser ist als alle anderen Religionen gleichzeitig, wenn man das Ultimate-Wissen hat, das verborgene Secret-Wissen, Weißt du, nur mit einem verschiedenen Schlüssel. Also dort steht die Wahrheit normal und über die Wahrheit legst du nochmal einen kodierten Schlüssel, wo du was ganz anderes rauskriegst. Was ja nur die es verstehen, aus der 7. Dimension, mit der 5. Wenn du dich nämlich wehrst, bist du 4. Dimension. Wenn du schläfst in Schlaf, bist du 3. Dimension. Wenn du aber so erleuchtet bist, wie die sind und das Licht siehst, das bist du in der 5. bis zur 7. Dimension. Ich sag dann meistens hier, du bist im Keller, im Schuppen, eingesperrt, 2 Hunde vor dir, die dich langsam auffressen, aber ja, genau, 7. Dimension. Bild dir das nur ein. Träum dich in deine eigene Welt hinein. 100% Geist oder alles Dualität. Aber dann kommen 2 Säulen und eine 3. Frau dazwischen. Im Namen des Vaters, des Sohnes und der heiligen Frau. Geist, Frau, also die ja aus der Küche die. Ja? Sie ist die Creatorin. Wenn ich eine Woche nicht aufwasche, habe ich Leben. Wenn sie da unten, hat sie intelligentes Leben. Männer erschaffen mit der Hand, schreiben die Geschichte. Sie macht die Zukunft. Das Runde muss ins Eckige rein. Deswegen muss die Schöpfung, wie sie aktuell ist, vernichtet werden. Föten gefressen oder das Kind nach der Geburt so oft geimpft, bis es nicht mehr intelligent ist. Weil das Produkt des Schöpfers ist genial. Es hat nur einen Fehler. Es endet. Und du kannst alles, was du geklaut hast, nie mitnehmen. Und das kotzt sie daran. Jetzt bist du schon stinkreich und reichst über die Welt, aber irgendwann stirbst du. Du brauchst Transhumanismus und du brauchst die Sklaven, die dich bis dahin bringen. Die dir immer natürlich erzählst, du bist ein guter König, natürlich. Mit einem Panzer. Es ist alles eine riesengroße Lüge. Aber jedes Mal in verschiedenen Facetten, die man detailliert anschauen muss. Dann sieht man nämlich eine Schlacht zwischen verschiedenen Gruppen. Man kann ja einfach sagen, die sind alle böse. Das kann man nicht so sagen. Das war das gleiche, würde ich sagen, alle Moslems sind hier Terroristen, die es nur noch nicht wissen. Und alle Juden fressen Babys. Nee. Differenzieren. An ihren Taten bewerten. Nie durch quatschen, das kann ich auch den ganzen Tag. Aber am Ende müssen 10 Zettel fertig sein. Jeden Tag ein Stück. Also, das Jesuiten-, Maurer- und Templer-Ding hätten wir gelöst. Wenn jetzt nämlich bei den Templern, bei der finalen Schlacht, ein Billboard mit einem Dudelsack reinkommt und die Polizei mit einem Kleeblatt aus Irland und ein blonder Deutscher noch dazu, dann hätten wir die Iren, die Schotten und die Deutschen. Noch ein Romanov dabei, mit Erzengel Michael etc. Da hätten wir die 4 Stängel der Unvernunft. Die Berserker von nebenan, die noch wissen, wie man aufs Maul haut, dem Bösen. Da gibt es ja noch die Deutschen. Frag mal die Römer, frag mal Napoleon, frag mal egal wer hier kam. Niemand greift uns freiwillig an. Merkel greift ja nie ein, die sitzt ja nur. Wie zerstörst du ein Land? Du machst es über den langsamen Weg, über die Infiltration. Das ist auch wieder Alchemie, eine Prozessalchemie. Das zu dem und am Ende kommt das raus. Mit Hegel und Dialektik, perfekt. 1 Million Erleuchtete und alle haben dieselbe Idee. Wow. Ihr seid ja mal erleuchtet. Sie würden es aber nie anzweifeln, denn Logik gibt es dort nicht. Logik ist der Feind der New Age. Wenn 2 + 2 5 ist, dann hast das zu sein. Denn du glaubst doch auch an die Quantenebene und das Rauchmonster am Ende des Universums und lutschst seine Eier und denkst, das wäre das Licht. Du glaubst viel, wenn der Tag lang ist. Auch an Corona. Und davor haben sie Angst. Obwohl es ja auch wieder bloß Flux ist.
World Christianity and return to these forms of paganism. That is what the occult's God is. And so Blavatsky responds saying, and are those of Jesuitism then so much cleaner? And she says that Pike's quote, our adversaries numerous and formidable, she says that sentence says it all. Who are these so formidable enemies? It's useless to inquire. They are the Roman Catholics and some of the Reformed Presbyterians. So point blank, she's saying that the formidable enemies of Freemasonry, according to our Pike and her, are the Roman Catholics. And so obviously this is the old world Catholicism, not.
Und hier ist der nächste Fehler. Die römisch-katholische Kirche in Rom ist der Feind. Nicht jeder Katholik. 1871 hatten die Freimaurer über den Vatikan gewonnen. Dann kamen die Jesuiten in die Freimaurer rein und seitdem ficken die Freimaurer sich gegenseitig, ohne zu wissen, dass sie vom Teufel gefickt werden und bauen Vatikan II auf. The Dark Genesis. Das Corona Golem System mit Skynet, Lasers in the Sky, mit Great Reset, mit Merkel Move und Greta und allem. Die perfekte Diktatur. Da haben die 1717er gemerkt, scheiße. Bloß gut, dass ich die alle gleichzeitig provoziere, sodass die oder zuhören hier und endlich mal was lernen. Weil das ist ja der Vorteil daran. Ob nur bei der Polizei, beim Verfassungsschutz oder bei den Lotion Boys. Du musst nur zuhören. Ihr Pisas. Weil das ist ja das Faszinierende daran. Die glauben alle daran, dass es keinen freien Willen gibt und vorherbestimmt ist. Sie vertrauen darauf, dass die 33. Stufe da oben sie nicht vergewaltigen und ficken wird. Und sie glauben an eine mystische Schule, die es so nie gab. Naja, das Coole daran ist, in dem Augenblick, wo in ihrer Gematria mein Name ganz oben als Messias da stand auf dem weißen Pferd, sagten die zum ersten Mal, nein, freier Wille. Wenn Falke dort oben steht, spiele ich nicht mehr mit. Nee, kann nicht sein. Und somit habe ich sie noch vom Glauben befreit, dass sie jetzt endlich einen normalen Glauben haben. Die Erlösung eines Freimaurers ist schon das direkte Ticket in den Himmel. Jeder Freimaurer, der befreit wird von Luzifers Eiern, ist direkt Ticket in den Himmel. Und ich habe schon so viele befreit von ihrem Glauben, indem ich es erstmal aufgeklärt habe von dem Hippietum. Somit habe ich dort oben garantiert schon eine Luxusvilla mindestens. Ist nicht, dass ich es dafür mache. Ja, also so ist es ja nie. Aber man muss es verstehen. Man muss verstehen, dass über die handwerkliche Freimaurerei aus Deutschland und die philosophische aus England, die Philosophen ohne Moral dann mit ihrem Friedhof der Kuscheltiere sagten, Kritik an der Vernunft. Bring doch mal ein paar Babys um und guck, was passiert. Wir dürfen keine Sperren im Denken haben. Wir müssen weiterdenken, als bisher jemand dachte. Natürlich, Illuminaten. Wir erschaffen einen neuen Mensch, eine neue Welt, alles komplett neu. Aus dem Reagenzglas. Aus ihrer Feder. Und sie sind halt nun mal luziferisch. Die Devil's Best Agents. Würden die euch jetzt freiwillig mit gutem Zeug impfen? Nein. Würden sie euch töten? Nein. Warum denn das? Ihr sollt euch doch gegenseitig töten. Ihr sollt euch gegenseitig töten, damit die 10 Gebote mit der globalen Schuld, dann kann man sagen, damit sowas niemals passiert. Eure Freiheit hat dahin geführt. Ihr hattet so viel Freiheit, dass ihr Freiheit, bis ihr euch allen gegenseitig die Freiheit auf den Sack ging und ihr euch sie selbst verboten habt. Ich kann so lange laut machen, wie ich will. Und mein Nachbar kann mir dafür aufs Maul hauen, wie er will. Meine Freiheit endet, wo seine anfängt. Harmonie. Wenn du das den Leuten aber nie erklärst, philosophisch gesehen, ist Freiheit, ich kann machen, was ich will. Ich hämmer meinen Sack auf den roten Platz. Ja, genau. Ich zünd eine rote Kirche an und fick dort 10 Frauen drin. Der Orthodoxe würde mich einsperren ins Gulag. In Griechenland mittlerweile kriegst du dort noch einen schwulen Papst dazu. Wenn ich Quatsch, einen schwulen Prediger. Also, man hat infiltriert, zerstört, minimal abgeändert, geupdatet, angepasst, Narrative geändert und Krisen erzeugt, um dann die Lösung, die ultimative Lösung, das Arbeiterparadies, Paradies auf Erden, das sozialistisch-bolschewistische, marxistische Endweltrevolutionsgedings mit dem Berliner Welthauptstadt für die Arbeiterwohlfahrt von Berlin, vom Thron des Teufels, von Pergamon, mit ihrer Dienerin, dem Merkel-Move und dem brennenden Move in Amerika. Wenn ihr immer versteht, was Berlin war, bevor es fiel, wenn ihr versteht, dass diese Freaks die ganze Menschheit ficken wollten und das Einzige, was sie aufhalten konnte, war Deutschland, Ostdeutschland, Sachsen, Dresden. Tja, 25 Ritter aus Dresden und ein V. Ich habe mich immer gefragt, von meinem Haus gegenüber riesengroß V und S dran steht. 50 cm pro Buchstabe. Als ich aus meiner alten Bude rausgeflogen bin, weil mein Arbeitgeber nicht zahlen konnte und dort einziehen musste mit der Hälfte der Möbel, dachte ich mir, das geht nicht schlimmer, guck raus, ist drin riesen V und S. Woher wussten die das? Es ist verrückt. Zum Glück glaube ich an so einen Unfug nicht. Ich glaube an das, was ich mit der Hand machen kann. Wie aufs Maul hauen, wenn du im Weg stehst. Ist auch nur ein Prozess. Warum schlägst du dich selbst? Warum schlägst du dich selbst? Warum schlägst du dich selbst? Es tut mir leid, dass es mir nicht leid tut. Du brauchst einen Eric Cartman und kannst bei ihm überall Error auslösen. Nur Knicke, der Illuminat, der Babys fraß, hindert euch daran. Weil ihr wollt ja Knicke nicht enttäuschen. Wie bist du denn drauf? Ein Unmensch, ein Rüpel. Hast du nichts von Knicke gehört? Doch, der Babyfresser Knicke. Wieso haltet ihr euch dran? Weil es euer höchstes Gut ist, der Knicker zu sein. Geknickt nach vorne gebeugt durchs Land zu laufen. Faszinierend, immer und immer wieder. Was will ich sagen? Die Katholiken sind entscheidend. Warum wurde Dresden 45 mit Operation Gomorrah ausgebombt? Meine Oma stand mittendrin. Ohne sie wäre mein Papa nicht da und dann wäre ich hier irgendwo nie da. Aber andere wahrscheinlich auch nicht. Hat Churchill versucht, die Geschichte zu bomben? Hat er sich im Datum gehört? Ist es nicht lustig, dass ich dann seinen Neffen finde beim Chef von Serco, der größten geheimen Firma, und alle ihre Terroranschläge, dass ich dann ihre Terror-Hotline bei Crisis Solution als Wix-Vorlage nehme? Big Daddy, Baghdadi, schick mal die Nutten rein. Natürlich, alle Wichser, ruft bei der ISIS ein, bis die Hotline down ist. Dann schreiben sie auch online rein. Du hast meine Oma bombardiert, jetzt gehe ich dir auf den Sack. Und das im Sitzen. Mit 175 Anschlägen. Online. Cybermobbing. Bis sie mich aus dem digitalen Sklavennetz, wo alle rein mussten, damit sie besser versklavt sein sollen, da wollten sie mich rausschmeißen auf Google und Facebook und überall. Ich durfte nicht mehr mitspielen als Virus in ihrem System. Da schmeißt die KDR raus. Und löscht dich und löscht dich und löscht dich und löscht dich und löscht dich. Weil alle MK-Ultra-Tricks und alle psychologischen Kriegsführungen und Mindgames nie funktionieren. Alle Freud und psychologischen Analysen und alles, den Gruppenzwang, das Groupthink und alles, was halt studiert wurde und analysiert, irgendwie nie klappt. Bei mir. Dann wirst du ausgeschlossen aus der globalen Diktatur. Dann darfst du nicht mitspielen. Warum? Weil ich gebubst habe.
Not so much as we see it today, as many people kind of protest. So before I move on, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to respond. I know I kind of said a lot there.
No, that's it. Yeah, that's a good background because we have this, the old church sort of had, it recognized Freemasonry as an enemy, and that it did indeed exist. It wasn't just some sort of wild conspiracy theory. Whereas today we hear very little of Freemasonry, and yet it's all over the place. Symbolism, its influence. It's like the whole modern world, you could say, is is one big Masonic lodge, and there is ample evidence to suggest that the church itself has been infiltrated long ago. So that's good background. So we have a traditional Roman Catholic Church lining up against Freemasonry, and even Freemasons themselves are identifying this this dichotomy.
Yes, exactly. And Blavatsky was a theosophist, so you can lump that into it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting. They don't really mention anyone else except for some Reformed Presbyterians. I don't really know exactly who she's referring to there. But numero uno enemy is the Roman Catholics. So the last thing I'll read here. Oh, yeah, Albert Pike's quote, she said, was taken from the proceedings of the Supreme Council of Sovereign Grand Inspector Generals, the 33rd and last degree. And this was this conference or a gathering was held in New York in 1876. So that's where it's sourced from with Pike. And so the last thing she says that the Templar inheritance of the Jesuits should hardly be boasted of. If the Knights Templar desire to make good in their claims, they must choose between a descent from the quote-unquote heretical, anti-Christian, Kabbalistic, primitive Templar.
Gut. 1876 sorgt er das. 1871 wurde der Vatikan vernichtet. Warum sorgt er das wohl? Warum wohl? Weil er für den vernichteten Vatikan kämpft, um Vatikan II später aufzubauen? Hat er deswegen antichristlich-kabbalistische Prinzipien bei den Templern eingeführt, damit die Templer sich gegen den Schöpfer wenden? Damit es Dark Templer werden, die ohne Moral plötzlich agieren und vergessen, dass sie doch eigentlich gerade einen Illuminat und Jesuit zuquatscht von dem Vatikan, den sie gerade besiegt haben. Das ist die perfekte Täuschung.
aka the good guys, according to Blavatsky, or connect themselves with the Jesuits and nail their tessellated carpets directly on the platform of ultra-Catholicism. So, what she's saying is that the true Templar...
No, also, stellst du dich auf die Seite der Ultrakatholiken, dann bist du wie ein Jesuit. Weil die Jesuiten wurden doch besiegt und nennen sich halt Illuminaten und reden gerade mit dir. Und sagen dir, du darfst nicht ultrakatholisch sein. Verlier deine Moral. Sei doch lieber eher bei den Good Guys. Ne? Wichtig, die Good Guys. Also, die ohne Moral sind die Good Guys. Komm doch in die Lucifer Club. Das ist der Trick des Teufels. Und wenn du dann seinen hier Dreizack im Arsch hast und dann heulst, oh, du hast mich angelockt, das ist der Teufel, Mensch, du. Dann mach das nur mal so. Also, Jesuit sagt, sei kein Ultra-Katholik. Wenn du das bist, bist du Jesuit. Sagt der Jesuit zum Templer. Das ist okay. Aber der Jesuit ist ja Illuminat, wo die Maurer los. Und dann wundert ihr euch, wie die Leute nicht mehr durchsehen konnten und Kriege geschehen konnten.
If anyone's to speak of them in their truest form, then they are the anti-Christian Kabbalist Templars, and the ones heretical to the Catholic Church back in the day. That's who the good guys are, according to her. And Albert Pike has a whole chapter dedicated to this. And she says, if you're going to connect yourself with the Templars and the Jesuits, then you're basically just being ultra-Catholic. So, you hear a lot of stuff in the conspiracy.
Und das ist perfekt. Du kannst schlecht zu jemandem sagen, der gerade noch den Vatikan bekämpft hat. Jo, das, was du glaubst, das ist ja jesuitisch. Leg das mal ab. Sagt der verkleidete Jesuit als Illuminat. Und so bringt der Teufel den Guten dazu, den guten Glauben abzulegen, weil er hat ja gesagt, ich kämpfe gegen die. Und er hat gewonnen. Er hat die Geschichte bloß nicht verstanden, weil der Vatikan war böse, weil Jesus von hier war. Und sie sagten, er war von da. Sie schrieben das Buch andauernd um. Das war das Problem mit dem Vatikan. Deswegen musste er weg. Als er weg war, kamen die das Buch immer umgeschrieben haben, als Illuminaten zurück. Und erzählten neue Geschichten. 1717 die Mauer waren anders als die 1725. Und dann 1876, nach 1871, der Vatikan war weg, da kam Albert Pike und erzählte denen, hier, das ist was Neues, hier mit eurem alten Denken. Wir haben viel Cooleres aus dem Universum, kosmisch, mit unserem Weltbild am Ende des Universums hier, the ultimate Engineer Creator, weder gut noch schlecht, Gedings. Was dir Befehle gibt, die du einfach ausführst, ohne darüber nachzudenken, dass es ein Rauchmonster ist, dem du gerade einen Körper baust, der dann endlich ein festes Fundament bekommt und dann die gesamte Welt in einem Skynet-Golem-Konstrukt als Deep Dream. Tja, wir Deutschen halt, bauen Dinge und stellen fest, scheiße.
World where people are connecting the Templars and Jesuits, and some people are separating them, but Blavatsky is making this particular distinction. Kabbalist Templars, good. Catholic Templars, bad. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there to show where they're coming from with all of this.
So you're saying that the Templars there was a division or an infiltration?
She doesn't think there was. She thinks that the Templars from the very beginning were Kabbalist occultists, and that was the whole reason for their existence. Now, that's her viewpoint.
Okay.
So I just think it's pretty interesting that's how they view it. Now, obviously, we discussed this a little bit, and you're on my podcast, how, there's this idea that the Templars were originally part of traditional Catholicism, and then perhaps some of them got seduced by mystery religion doctrines when they went over, to the east near Jerusalem and whatever, and perhaps not, who knows. But I think it's very interesting seeing their perspective on it, and they're very strong opinions about it.
Mhm.
Es wurde der Golden Dawn eingeführt, die Hermetik Order, es wurde neu einfach gedacht und dann wurden Bilder vorgelegt aus Indien und aus Middle East, die erstmal aussahen, als wäre laut dem Weltbild und dem Zeitgeist von damals das Wissen von da unten gekommen und auch, Mensch du, die Bilder kommen auch von da unten. Und man dachte so an mystische Schulen in Ägypten, die es ja nicht gab. Man guckt auf die Dokumente und dachte sich, okay, vielleicht ist ja unser Templertum nicht das wahre Templertum, sondern vielleicht haben wir uns ja gehört, vielleicht ist das verrückte, gestörte Templertum da, vielleicht das richtige Templertum. Das Kabbala-Templertum ohne Moral oder das mit Moral, das katholische Templertum. Würde der Teufel dir helfen oder würde er dich ficken? Das ist ganz einfach.
So the last thing I'll do before I get into some of the ties to JFK assassination with this, I just wanted to kind of make some distinctions about, Templars and Freemasons and Jesuits and how it kind of plays out in history. And so according to H.P. Blavatsky and some of the other occult writers, they say that the Jesuits infiltrated Freemasonry and rewrote some rituals. And the rewriting of these rituals were to make the Masons swear oaths to a personal god of Catholicism. So it's kind of funny, like, they're telling us that the Templars want to infiltrate the Vatican and install their secret doctrines and rule behind the scenes, and somehow that's okay. But when it happens that the Jesuits come in and rewrite their secret doctrines, oh my God,
No, und das ist jetzt der Trick. Die Templer wollen den Vatikan infiltrieren und übernehmen. Die Illuminaten schreiben aber ihre Rituale um und somit arbeiten die Templer, ohne es zu wissen, für den Teufel. Weil sie ihr Ritual weil sie dumm sind, weil sie 32er statt 33er Level sind. Infiltration, Rewrite, die Rituale, lass die Bitch laufen für dich. Ne? Die Templar Bitch. Die nicht merkt, dass sie gefickt wird. Ne? Takedown Vatikan, was aber dann eigentlich nur das Türöffner für die 33er Illuminaten ist, die ja dann Vatikan infiltrieren haben und alles andere infiltriert haben und die Freimaurer infiltriert haben und infiltriert haben, was dann automatisch zum Code 1984 führt, über 666 zur Kreta und zum Reset. Die letzte Schlacht der Menschheit. Weil Templer zu blöd sind und Maurer auch, muss Veikko halt ran. Und immer 33 senden, weil sie ja daran glauben. Gehst aufs Klo, kackst erstmal 33 gesendet. Was glauben sie auch daran? Ich kann es verstehen, dass sie sauer sind auf mich. Bei nonverbaler Kommunikation, sie wussten nicht mal bis vor 1,5 Jahren, wie ich aussehe oder überhaupt. Sie dachten, ich heiße nicht Veikko, ich bin nicht blond und. Und dann sendet er immer 33. So wie sie es machen würden. Ja, das nennt sich Täuschung. Mit ihren Codes sie ficken. Aufklärung im Feindesland. Analyse. Es ist nicht verboten, die Trickster zu tricksen. Denn die wollen uns umbringen. Wenn du denen sagst, was passiert, würden sie versuchen, es zu verhindern? Sagen sie euch, was passiert und ihr versucht es zu verhindern und löst es aus. Deswegen sage ich ihnen, sie haben schon längst verloren. Sie dann versuchen es zu verhindern und lösen es aus. Bam! Ist so einfach, oder?
freak out and they're like, this is the worst thing ever. And they're like, this is the most blasphemous, disgusting thing. Like if you read the doctrines, you can tell when they get emotional about stuff. So I think that was pretty funny.
Yeah, Turnabout's fair play, right?
Jesus gab es definitiv. Er ging in Jena vorbei. Abraham ging nach Gera, Stadtteil Paradies, über Maria Magdalena und ihre Kinder, definitiv. Der Schöpfer der Juden, den gab es auch. Der war ja Bock. Er kam aus Atlantis über die Boxsage, aus der Pandora-Ära, die Box der Pandora, die Box von der Bock-Saga mit dem gehörnten Tier und der Wikingerrune. Das passt schon alles. Jesus gab's, Atlantis gab's, den Schöpfer der Juden gab's. Sie wollten bloß nicht ansprechen, dass er gehörnt war. Oder Schöpfer, es war nun mal der Schöpfer. Affe hat Ziegel gebumst, hinten kamen 2 Dinger raus. Okay, Frey und Freya. Kann man nun mal nie ändern. Ist halt passiert. Können wir gerne testen, ob es stimmt. Gib mir eine Ziege und einen Affen, die filmen wir ab. Wenn da aber eine Merkel rauskommt, war ich's nicht. Dann bin ich nicht dabei gewesen, dann war ich nicht mal in der Nähe. Aber können wir testen. Halbe Stunde beim Zoo.
Yeah, exactly. So the Templar and Jesuit connection, it's through this type of Freemasonry. This is at least one example of it. And apparently some of these degrees were the Knights Kadash or the Holy Knights, the Templar degrees. And so apparently the reasoning for this was that there's Freemasonic connections to Charles I, the king who was beheaded, and then Charles II, and then James II, his other son. So some people will say they were Freemasons. And so she's saying the context of that is that they were trying to give Roman Catholicism a say in Freemasonry to secretly get a Roman Catholic monarch back on the throne of England.
Yeah.
So that is the reason for the Jesuits, intermingling with Freemasonic doctrines. It was sort of like a...
Und das ist ja das Geile. Jesuiten machen Protestantismus, führen Protestanten gegen Katholiken ein. Dann gehen die Jesuiten zu den Katholiken und sagen, hier, wolltest du nicht einen Katholen wieder in England haben, während sie hintenrum aber den Protestanten liefern. Das ist die Bitch, die alle gleichzeitig fickt.
Covert operation to bring back a Catholic king.
Which is very Jesuit.
Yeah, there you go. And so...
I mean, their job was counter-reformation. So
Mhm.
they were, you could see them behaving that way. So.
Yeah. And so...
Yeah, intrigue, yeah.
Yeah, so if people are going to complain that that's bad, well, what about the occultists infiltrating on their end, And so it's kind of like you'll have this theme of the pot calling the kettle black all the time. And we talked about this with, the idea of pedophilia in the Catholic Church, but then no one talks about pedophilia in Hollywood, Why is that omitted, So that's sort of like another theme that kind of runs through a lot of the stuff I've noticed. But so apparently, according to Blavatsky and a lot of these Masons, these Jesuits ended up in France, and they say that they were part of this high chapter of Claremont, and then this would be associated with Parisian Templars. And so any false Masons, according to them, or any false Templars, they would be tied to these Masonic ones in France that have these Jesuit influences. And so the reason I bring this up is because this is kind of like in line with, remember the Jesuits got kicked out of France or expelled from France just before the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if maybe there is something interesting with this connected. But either way, Blavatsky, she basically sources from this Freemason named Charles Sotheran, and he was a theosophist. And she's saying that the sectarian Masonry, where the Masons don't accept particular groups based on ethnic or religious background. So if Masons don't accept Jews or they don't accept atheists, they're saying that's not true Masonry. And this is supposedly the Catholic doctrine put into there, that this is part of that corruption. And so it's acceptable to accept atheists and Jews into Masonry because they think that their secret doctrine, you can derive their God from any worldview, even atheism. And this is my contention, that through science, indoctrinating people into science is actually indoctrinating them into the mystery religion. This is a whole side topic, but the Big Bang theory is actually comes from Kabbalah, the cosmic egg, primordial.
Big Bang ist Kabbalah. Ja. Ist auch eine Theorie, muss nur dran glauben. Denn was ihr Wissenschaft nennt, nennen sie Black Magic mit K, was dann zu Chaos Magic wird. Bei Leuten, die keine Ahnung haben, was sie dort machen.
Matter, a single point that birth an infinite universe. This is all tied to Kabbalistic stories of creation. So that's something I go in occult science. So that to me, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I heard Michael Hoffman said that the Enlightenment itself was the Kabbalah applied to Christianity. So.
Yeah. And so they were basically saying any religion.
Das ist das nächste dann. Moment. Das ganze Enlightenment, die Erleuchtung ist quasi Erleuchtung bei Baller. Rechnen wir mal zusammen. Frankreich, Jakobiner rot, Frankisten rot, wurde übernommen. 1776 hat Frankreich aus österreichischer Hand mit preußischen General Amerika als erstes anerkannt und die Jesuiten rausgeschmissen. Dann auch brannte Frankreich, man köpfte Marie Antoinette. Frankreich rot. Russland nach Romanow Tod rot. Schottland Jakobiner rot. England seit 1666 rot. China seit 1970 oder seit keine Ahnung wann Mauer rot. Die Templer haben den Heiligen Gral, wir Deutschen haben den Kaiser und die Wikinger, Illuminaten, Maurer und Templer sind uneins versus die Jesuiten. Und mittendrin 1984, als V geboren wurde, aber auch die Ex-Order 12473, von dort waren es noch 33 Jahre bis zur Endschlacht, wo ich dann in Woche 33 und Sendung 33 Stunden ihn auf den Sack gehen konnte und sie perfekt ficken konnte. Einfach nur, weil zur richtigen Zeit geboren. 9.9.84. Ihre Gesetze kamen am 1.4.84. Die Ex-Order. Ist klar, dass beides gleichzeitig endet. Dass der Unfug klappt, das ist der Witz.
Religion, even atheism, it can be part of true masonry. So it's pretty interesting that current day Vatican, you know, you're having the Pope say things like, you know, anybody can be accepted in the kingdom of heaven, stuff like that. I'm not super up to date, but that's something I've heard. Is that true?
Yeah. Well, who am I to judge, as the Pope said, supposedly said. The Pope's quoted, he's often quoted, and then people defending him say, well, he's being misquoted. He said a lot of these things, a lot of the ecumenical approach since Vatican II is very much consistent with the agenda of Freemasonry, with indifferentism. And, the idea of
Genau, 1971, Vatikan II. Der neue Vatikan. 1871 war er besiegt. 100 Jahre später war er reborn. The Ultimate Devil Evil 2.0 Super Vatikan. Nachdem Hitler ihn befreit hat. Weil die haben ihn eingesperrt. Dann kam Hitler und hat ihn befreit. Deswegen haben der Vatikan dann später Hitler geholfen. Darunter nach Argentinien. Und dort ging es nach Dallas. In Dallas haben sie abgedrückt. Beim Ritualmord. Kill the King. The Devil Style. Überall die rote Pest und auf deutschem Boden. Die DDR haben wir überlebt. Ihr habt jetzt die Grünen und die Roten und die Linken. Die sozialistisch-bolschewistische Weltrevolution mit der Antifa, der neuen Linken und den Logen und den ganzen Täuschern und die internationale kommunistische Partei und. Wie kann man denn allen gleichzeitig auf den Sack gehen und auch nur damit durchkommen?
Yeah, the idea of everyone having their own way of God as opposed to through the Catholic Church. So yeah, you can see a lot of that in there. A lot of the, we've had popes attend, I think, Hindu rituals, things like that. Or recently, Katy Perry was invited to give a talk in transcendental meditation at the Vatican.
Nice.
So yeah. So it's there. So
Right. So this is, the true masonry doesn't discriminate. Everything's equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you have masonry that doesn't let Jews in or something like that, that's the Jesuit corruption,
Mm-hmm.
according to her. And also, if you're swearing any sort of oath to a personal deity, that's another Jesuit corruption, according to Blavatsky. So this is kind of the context of these things intermingling. And then Albert Pike apparently rewrote several degrees of Freemasonry, and this is kind of believed to rectify some of those corruptions. And I'm sort of still looking into this. I've been reading through all kinds of stuff, and it gets a little confusing. But this Knights Kadosh, or the Templar chapter in Morals and Dogmas, supposedly this is one of those, and that's one of the ones that they say got corrupted. So if you're bringing the Knights Templar into it, Albert Pike supposedly set the record straight. If anybody wants more background into this, I suggest you read Albert Pike's 30th chapter of Morals and Dogma. It's not very long, but it's all about their viewpoint on the Templars' infiltration of the Vatican. So I think that's something that's worth checking out. So that's from Blavatsky's camp. Now, from what I've read in history, James II, the one they were trying to esoterically get on the throne, he was the last Catholic monarch of Britain and was deposed by the quote unquote glorious revolution, right? Everything's always glorious when Catholicism gets deposed, or the Enlightenment enlightens the Dark Ages. That's part of the alchemy, the illumination of the darkness. So what's darkness? The occultists, the Catholic Church. So when they illuminate it, that's part of the alchemy. That's just the basic doctrine. So, and then the French Jesuits were expelled in 1764 because of Antoine de la Valette, who apparently was excommunicated from the Jesuits for running up debt and gambling in a colony, I think in South America. And a lot of this behavior is tied to his intermingling with Dutch merchants. Now, I don't know a lot about the Dutch merchants, but are they considered to be like kind of like Jewish bankers? I don't know. You know more about that than I would.
Yeah, I also heard that it was the Dutch merchants in Japan which started a whispering campaign to get the Jesuits kicked out of Japan in the 16th century.
Oh, okay.
So there's a lot of scheming behind the scenes, and Dutch, and that's a lot of the Sephardic Jews who left Spain in the 15th century went to the Netherlands and set up shop there, where they took over banking and I want to understand publishing. So they controlled banking and media back then.
Okay, and I wonder if, like, obviously banking ties to mercantilism and stuff like that. So this La Valette guy, he got indebted to the Dutch merchants. So, indebting people with money, that seems to be a common theme. So he got expelled by the Jesuits because he just made a huge mess. But the result was French Parliament used this against the Jesuits and said that, you need to pay these debts. And so basically the Jesuits were bankrupted because of this La Valette character. So this led to their expulsion and their downfall. And French Parliament was the main driving force behind it. And one thing that's interesting is that in this 8th chapter of Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky, she uses all these polemics against the Jesuits that come from Protestant sources. And she says that everything that she's using comes from some manuscripts in Britain that were verified by French Parliament. So she's saying French Parliament's word on these doctrines is gold, basically. But of course, French Parliament, they're the ones that are warring with the monarchy. So is there an agenda there? I don't know. But either way, that's sort of like part of her polemic. She's always using Protestants who are talking about, Jesuits basically advocating regicide and stuff like that. So who knows where that source is back from, if it's some of it's propaganda, if some of it's like back to the whole converso issue. I don't really know, but this is sort of her viewpoint that, everything that the Protestants put forth against the Jesuits is 100% legit, even though Blavatsky doesn't really like the Protestants, but they're a lot cooler than anything Roman Catholic. And so they always it's one pattern I noticed in her writing. She's always revering the Protestants when they're going against the Roman Catholic Church. But when she looks at them outside of that, she's always kind of shitting on them. So how ironic, she's glorifying them when they're, the enemy, my enemy kind of thing. So anyway, so I just thought this was all interesting because, eventually the monarchy basically the Louis the 16th got beheaded.
15th? Yeah, I'm sorry. I think it was the 15th who suppressed the Jesuits. But
yeah.
16th one lost his head.
Yeah, and apparently his family wanted the Jesuits, his wife and children and some advisors, I guess, but some people were saying he was kind of weak or getting older. I don't know, but the point being is that this is sort of the history that I'm kind of merging with the occult viewpoint. And so when I bring it to kind of like the truther world, a lot of people saying, oh, the Jesuits are responsible for everything, they were behind the French Revolution or something like that. And so my question is, if we're to look at the mindset of the controllers or people like Blavatsky, why would Jesuit Freemasons who allegedly infiltrated Masonry for the purposes of placing a Catholic monarch on Britain's throne, why would they aid in the French Revolution to overthrow a Catholic monarch? That makes no sense whatsoever. So I'm just trying to sort out like some of the things that I've heard being in the truther world over the years, where like everything is blamed on the Jesuits, and then it's kind of like couple it with what some of these occultists are saying. So the idea of Charles I and his lineage, this ties into JFK because of the assassination ritual of the death and resurrection of Osiris. And some people will tie the killing of the king, Charles I, to this, but I wonder if part of that is because of the quote-unquote Jesuit corruption infiltrating and sort of messing with some of these Freemasonic ideas. So before I move on, I'll let you respond. And again, that was a lot to take in.
Well, this is, of course, I think we're talking, 18th century France? The mid 18th century?
Yeah.
And of course, I think it was 1717 is when the Grand Lodge opened up. And that's when the British took over Freemasonry as sort of a part of their imperial project. But that was, of course, after the Glorious Revolution, which I think was 1688, if I have my history correct. And this also coincides with the creation of the Bank of England in the 1690s and these things, all these intrigues, financial intrigues and these things. But if you talk about the French Parliament sort of intriguing against Jesuits, at this time France was peppered with Masonic lodges who were sort of like controlling the public discourse such as it existed among the intellectuals, the salons, and they were sort of spreading Freemasonic doctrine. And of course, one of the Voltaire, I think, who was hanging out in Switzerland, I think, wrote much of the mythology of the Dark Ages and also the Jesuits and the role of the Catholic Church at this time has been influenced by Voltaire's interpretation. And of course, Voltaire was a Whig agent. Basically, he was a British agent. So when you cite these, when you cite people who cite these sources going back to 18th century France, but these are Freemasonic sources. So they have to, you have to be a little skeptical of their interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the main point I wanted to get across is that if people stumble across like Jesuit stuff intermingled with Freemasonry in France, I think that this is an interesting perspective where the occultists are saying that yeah, they did try to infiltrate, but it doesn't mean that they're responsible for all of the Freemasonic doctrine. They were just trying to get into a certain segment of it. And why would they be supporting the French Revolution? That would make no sense, So just trying to clarify some confusion that, things that I kind of heard just listening to people talk. And now when I'm looking at this stuff, I'm like, wait a second, that doesn't make sense to me, or this doesn't, so.
Yeah, and with the Jesuits out of the way, the path was cleared for the destruction of the Catholic French monarchy.
Exactly. Yeah. And so anyways, let's fast forward to the JFK presidency and how some of this stuff might relate. And I'll just give a quick disclaimer that I'm not saying that I know what happened on 11/22. I've heard tons of theories. There's the Oliver Stone version. There's people saying that the whole event was a staged hoax. There's people saying that the Zapruder film is a hoax, but the assassination was real. Miles Mathis has a paper on how JFK faked his own death. So there's all kinds of crazy stuff that goes along with it. I don't even really know what I think anymore. But I think that the important thing is the symbolic statement of it, the esoteric allegory that might be conveyed, and then some of the things that happened in the 60s that we can sort of look at it from the perspective that we just did of the occultists, and then obviously the traditional Catholic Church.
Yeah, because we're talking about the actual magic of the event, because it's the alchemy that's created by the magic, and the magic is made possible by the perception, the interpretation of these events, which changed everything, so to speak. So that's what matters. Yeah. Exactly, it's changing the consciousness. So the alchemy and the occult, there can be physical components to it, and this gets into science and stuff like that. It's kind of like the distillation of water. You add fire, you burn off the impurities, and you release the air or the water in air form and its pure form, and you coagulate in something new, and you have the lead left over at the bottom. And that's kind of like a physical component of it. But there's a psychological component where you're transmuting a mindset. So again,
a Catholic mindset, which would be the lead, you put that under the fire and kill it off, and then you birth it into a new form and you keep repeating the process. That's sort of like the psychological aspect of this. So if you think about the idea of JFK being, a Catholic president, at least in, namesake or background, that would be seen as kind of a big deal, because there's always been sort of like this Catholicism phobia in America.
Und das ist der nächste wichtige Punkt. Kennedy war nicht direkt aus der Fratze der Queen-Blutlinie. Alle sahen aus wie die Queen und waren auch Abstammung von der Queen. Er nicht. Deswegen war er doch das Problem. Als eine jüdische Frau und ein Templer vor 1000 Jahren sich verliebten, erschufen sie eine Mischlingsblutlinie. Als Vampiren und Werwölfen. Nee, Quatsch. Ein über allen stehendes. Weil er ist dann nicht weiß und dann nicht schwarz. Er hat Liebe von da unten mit hier oben. Und die gingen dann über Irland, also über Thüringen nach Irland hoch. Und dann kam Camelot. Und dann kamen die Kennedys. Und dann kam Camelot 2 und dann kam das Attentat in Dallas. Das Pentagon wurde an 911 gebaut, um den letzten Befehl des Kaisers auszuführen. Als der letzte Befehl des Kaisers über Kennedy ausgeführt wurde, mit "Ich bin ein Berliner", wurde er hingerichtet. Der Kaiser gegen den Vatikan. Das ist doch das alte Schlachtdenken. Zar und Kaiser gegen Jesuiten und Vatikan. Landpower versus Seapower. Atlantis versus Ägypten Bloodlines. Wahrheit versus V. Oder andersrum. Ihr wisst das schon. Na, aber es ist nie einfach bloß ein Attentat. Das ist the ultimate. Und wenn man dann noch weiß, dass nach dem Attentat Jackie Kennedy in Arlington am Heldenfriedhof dieses Q-Denkmal eine Flamme einsetzen lassen hat. Diese hier. The Osiris Rise Eternal Flame. Close your eyes. Show me your move. No, einfach vertrauen. Diese Flamme brennt so lange bis Auferstehung. Osiris wurde zerstört und irgendwie kam er zurück. Ihr müsst die gesamte Geschichte der Menschheit zu verstehen, um dieses Attentat zu verstehen.
It dates back to, the whole point of the New World, and then taking out Catholic, French, and Spanish colonies, and, the British having pretty much control over the New World. And so I'm of the mindset that this was sort of like a ritual to basically do this. And so what happened, after or during, the assassination event, that was when Vatican II was happening. Am I correct? Some like around then it was like.
Oh yeah, it was right in the middle of it. Vatican
Yeah.
II was 62 to 65, I believe, or 62
Okay.
to 65. Yeah.
So there you go. This happened right in the middle of that. And I believe that that's symbolically connected now based on people's criticisms of Vatican II. And I'm not some expert on doctrine or anything like that. That's what's been helpful about listening to your podcast, hearing a lot of people talk about these sorts of things. So to me, from what I understand, Vatican II basically left a lot of things ambiguous to be more liberal and to kind of open itself up to the world on some level. Is that a fair assessment?
It was a sort of a reordering or a sort of a updating of the church to deal with modern problems. There wasn't any change in doctrine. The debate is the spirit of Vatican II versus the letter of Vatican II. And those who defend the idea behind Vatican II said that the doctrine that came out of it was sound, it wasn't implemented. The spirit of Vatican II, which was interpreted through the lens of the mass media, that this would have been Time Life, CIA, Freemasonic mass media. And so the church, from that standpoint, the church is guilty of a sort of a miscalculation or a naive belief that the media would report Vatican II correctly, and it didn't. It misinterpreted it, and that misinterpretation sort of spread throughout the world. and it was how it was implemented in the years afterwards, like the New Order Mass, the end of the Latin Mass, and the sort of change in church architecture, church music, these things where folk music was introduced in these things, and traditional.
Und das war alles 1971. Wann kam der Film Lucifer Rising raus? Im selben Jahr. Und der Schulmädchenreport auch. Und die Hotpen und die Antibabypille und die Scheidungsreform. Bingo! Der erste PC, Prozessor und die E-Mail und das Bill Gates Ding für die Wahlfälschung am Ende. Dann kam Limits to Growth und World Economic Forum von der VW Stiftung. Wie war das mit der Ölkrise 1970 davor? Ist das nicht alles ein riesengroßes Klimbim, was aussieht wie 20 einzelne Teile, die nichts miteinander zu tun haben, aber die alle zur selben Zeit zusammenkommen, um das perfekte, utopische Disney Gulag Wonderland zu erzeugen, ohne zu ahnen, wo ihr da reinschlendert. Und die es ahnten, wurden in Dallas gerichtet.
Joke that in Vatican II, the church opened up to the world and everyone left. But the context of Vatican II it wasn't like everything was fine. There were some problems, and the church was trying to come to terms with the modern world, particularly mass communication, because television was coming on. They were dealing with things like mass marketing of music, mass communication, and how do you deal with this? And that was the idea behind the church. Now, there are those who think what happened was that the church at that point was heavily penetrated by Freemasonic and also the CIA, Freemasonic elements and also the CIA, and they were going to more or less hijack and take it over. And they couldn't win. They couldn't win at Vatican II with the doctrine of the documents. They succeeded with its interpretation, which they did. Indisputably, they won the interpretation of Vatican II. The spirit of Vatican II won out over the letter of Vatican II. So that's kind of where it is. Yeah.
And that's consistent. Yeah, that's consistent with the esoteric doctrine, where it's the interpretations come from the Kabbalah. So Blavatsky and Pike will always say that you take the Hebrew Bible, but you apply the teachings of the Zohar, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Kabbalistic books to understand the true hidden meaning. So that kind of, it's a similar parallel. But yeah, either way, you also have
the good example. Just give the example of interpretation. Qualitäts, which was the idea of freedom of religion, separation of church and state, and the church's official position was that a confessional state is ideal, but they were willing to make a modus vivendi with a situation like the United States where there was no official religion. But the subsequent interpretation of Vatican II of Dignitas Humanis is that human dignity requires freedom of religion and no confessional state. So much so that now that virtually every Catholic is an Americanist, meaning that they don't believe in the confessional state. The confessional state is a violation, I guess, of human dignity, a violation of freedom. So much so that even the Pope, who is a Jesuit, now says that actually they actually speak out against the confessional state, which was completely different than what was supposedly issued forth by Vatican II in the 1960s. But it's that interpretation and the changing of the culture, that a chemical process that is proceeded. But that's just an example of it. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, okay, that's helpful because I don't know all these things, and so you just mentioned like the Pope now being a Jesuit. To me, it's the same thing as the Catholic Church. You have to sort of identify what people are saying about the nature of God or whatever to kind of, you're just getting a label of something. So that's kind of what when I'm talking about somebody being a Jesuit, there's lots of different versions of that. And so, the guy who made the Big Bang Theory, the Catholic priest who came from a Jesuit background, I would say that is much more in line with the Kabbalistic versions than the traditional, for obvious reasons. But so, you think also about in the 60s, the hippie or sexual revolution. So that's redefining the cult definition of virginity. And we talked about this a little bit last time, where it's kind of, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's sort of like, somebody who is virgin has the pure spirit of occultism, the pure gnosis in their consciousness. It has nothing to do with their physical body.
Yeah.
typical Gnostic fashion. Oh, you can go have sex all you want, and this is tied to like the Vestal virgins and then purifying yourself afterwards. And so this is what the high priestess card in occultism is about. It's about having the pure virgin doctrine or gnosis. And this relates back to Eastern religion and stuff like that. This is the pure spirit of Eastern religion. That's what the pure spirit of Lucifer is to the occultist. And so it's having that mindset that is virgin. So again, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but they just kind of take something and they throw an allegory on it, and all of a sudden it's truth, right?
Yeah. But I can understand. I can understand its appeal to some people.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're redefining that during this era, and then of course there's the feminist movements that start gaining steam. And so you think about the divine feminine. This is associated with the passive part of Lucifer rising, and the created being, right? Because the woman in occultism represents creation. And so if you have the creation becoming divine, then you have the divine feminine. It's not about women. It's about an allegory for creation, the created being becoming God, essentially. That's consistent with the doctrine. And so this is the whole point of occultism. Blavatsky talks about the unification of spirit and matter. So if you're going to unify the androgynous spirit, well, you need androgynous material body. So this to me is kind of all the gender crap going on, which is to me a precursor to transhumanism, but that's part of my occult science series. And then outside of that, the 60s ends with the moon landing. So this is the technology god, Prometheus. And this again ties into science and technology. You can't do all of these things without technology. You can't change your sex without technology. You can't have babies outside of a male and female relationship without technology, right? Or if you have, whatever. But this is all kind of part of the technology god. And so this is tied into this because Prometheus is a huge figure in Blavatsky's theology. She has whole chapters on him, and it's supposed to be, he's a figure of universal philanthropy and giving the divine spark or gnosis to mankind, and that can be through obviously technological means. And of course, they have a big statue of Prometheus at Rockefeller Center. Rockefeller, they provided the real estate for the United Nations, and they're all about so-called philanthropy. So that's what Prometheus is, universal philanthropy. But this liberation or philanthropy, again, is tied to liberating people from the occult Satan, right? The Catholic Church. So there you go. It's all consistent. And then apparently, from my understanding, schools had a lot of reforms during this time, especially Catholic schools. I listened to Charlotte Iserbyt talk a lot about this. And so this whole era is kind of symbolic of a lot of, intense changes and fundamental changes. And so I think that this killing of the king ritual and transmutation, it was almost like this grand symbolic statement of all of these things lumped into one. That's at least my sort of understanding of it all. And then from what I understand about Kennedy, I don't really know a whole lot about this kind of stuff, but people from the traditional Catholic side, I've heard, I think I heard E. Michael Jones criticize him on this before, where it's like, he put American democracy before, the Catholic faith. That's kind of like what I understand the biggest criticism. Is that true? I don't know. I'm asking you because that's just what I've heard.
Yeah, this was part of the Americanist infiltration of the American Catholic Church. The idea that you were American before you were Catholic, and America taught the Catholic Church, not the other way around. And you also had this dynamic of people like the Kennedys. They were often called lace curtain Irish. There's an inferiority complex vis-a-vis the WASP establishment. And so always wanted to be accepted, have a place at the table. And you had a phenomenon where if you were Catholic and you were accepted into the power structure, it came at a cost of your Catholic identity, meaning you weren't given a place at the table unless you shed your genuine Catholic identity. And the higher you rose up the political totem pole, the more you had to shed of your Catholic identity. And this is certainly true of the Kennedys, particularly after the 1960s. The idea, remember Kennedy gave that speech in 1960 when he was running, talking about he's an American first and these things. And this, who he had backing him up was this feller, Jesuit priest John Courtney Murray, who was being sponsored by Henry Luce in the Time Life Empire. And he's the one that came up. I think he wrote the book called We Hold These Truths, which is sort of his book about the doctrine of Americanism and how America was a just society and how America is a system of a separation of church and state, which is not in the Constitution, but the idea of no established church was the ideal political arrangement, not just one that the church coped with, as I was talking about earlier. So this became the model for the whole world. And it's at the same time, you can't take this out of the context of the Cold War, because the CIA, right after the World War II, acknowledged that the Catholic Church, having offices in every corner of the world, would be a great institution to infiltrate to use for the Cold War, which it did. And they had a doctrinal warfare program targeting the Catholic Church. And so they opened a Pro Dare University in Italy. They funded it lavishly, and this was promoting Americanism. At the same time, they are undermining confessional states, the traditional confessional states, like in Portugal or in Spain and even Italy. And, you know, when Salazar fell in 1973, 74, right, and Franco fell in 75, they were adopted modern or liberal constitutions, and these countries lost their Catholic identity. And a lot of this was a CIA operation, so much so, like in Portugal, the CIA was actually proliferating pornography to change the culture. And so programs like that. So this is the geopolitical context at the time. And the Vatican II, this is, go back to what I'm talking about Vatican, Vatican II was an opening that the CIA was able to get in there. And of course, when we talk about CIA, we also have examples of Freemasonic influence, because to get this Catholic Church on board with the Cold War agenda, they had to frighten the Catholic Church with communism. And this is part of that dialectic that was used, the Cold War dialectic, because, you know, communism, by final analysis, communism was a Western creation. But it was used to create this dialectic so they could corner the Catholic Church and they could side with the United States in the Cold War. And this was the best illustration of this infiltration might have been in the 1980s, when the Catholic Church worked with CIA and also a Freemasonic outfit in Italy. You know, what's the one in Rome, the Freemasonic organization that was caught up in Gladio. Name's failing me now, I'm sorry. But basically, to carry out certain covert operations, particularly the funding of Solidarity. And this involved the funneling or the laundering of drug money through the Vatican Bank and these things. So that's an example of corruption infiltration of the church for these political reasons.
Was it the Carbonari?
Oh, no.
Was that an older one? I just remember like that was, wasn't that a Masonic
You said it,
thing?
I get it. In fact, you know, it's the Propaganda Duet.
Okay, yeah, the Carbonari were back in the 1800s.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. This I'm saying this. Yeah, the P2 Lodge. And
yeah, Pete's too. There you go.
Propaganda
The Godfather 3, right?
Yeah, and that's what the Godfather was talking about. And basically, what it was sort of like an invisible or shadow government, and you had always high level officials or members of it, and it functioned, you know, sort of as a shadow government. But that's an example of sort of that infiltration of the church, the deal the church made in the Cold War. So I don't know how we got off of that, but anyway.
No, but that all ties into this, because that's part of that alchemical transmutation of going through these phases of bringing man to quote unquote enlightenment by shedding that old king or old Christendom mindset. And so this ties into JFK. And I'm just going to briefly name all of the rituals that you can connect to the assassination event. There's actually quite a few of them, but they all have somewhat similar themes. There's a couple outliers, but basically there's this idea of the killing and alchemical transmutation of the king ritual. And if you read Carl Jung's writings, he's got a whole book on this. I'll get into that a little bit later, but that's like what I base a lot of the research off of. And I almost feel like I'm reading from a script with all the things that happened in the JFK presidency. And so this ties into the death and resurrection of Osiris, also Hiram Abiff, and Jesus Christ. So, you know, again, bringing Christ into an equilibrium with those occult figures. And then there's also a component of the Azazel scapegoat ritual in Leviticus. and I have a couple of videos that I sourced from where a rabbi, Kabbalistic rabbi, gives his understanding of this scapegoat ritual, and it's atonement for sexual iniquity. So I believe that this is where the Marilyn Monroe affair comes into it. Whether it was real or not, it doesn't really matter in a lot of this occult ritual. It's more about the mindset or the consciousness of the people, because there's this idea of the king and the kingdom. There's a passive expression with that, so that the king reflects the people and vice versa, that sort of thing, and built into some of these occult rituals around the king. And so the other ones are Aleister Crowley's Night of Pan ritual. It's all tied to death and resurrection, the elimination of the ego, which is tied to that, old world sense. And then there's another Golden Dawn ritual that has a lot of esoteric parallels to it. That's a lot more advanced, so I'm not going to get into that at all because it's just too Kabbalistic, and I'm just sick of looking in depth at that kind of stuff. So, and then there's other sort of symbolism that you'll find in terms of fertility rites, Daley Plaza being a temple, the idea of the Vestal Virgins, the virgin that attends to the eternal flame. So this is kind of tied into Jackie Kennedy. And so this is sort of all encompassed in this event. And so I'll get into kind of like the main things that are associated with all of this and how it applies. First off, I was just going to talk about the idea of Kennedy being the king of Camelot, right? That's something we've heard over the years. And you look in, magazines all throughout since his assassination. They won't shut up about it. Even today, it's like JFK's Camelot, Camelot Lives, People Magazine, Time Magazine, Vanity Fair, Life Magazine, all that stuff. It's all about Camelot.
And there was wasn't there also a play on Broadway going on at the time? Music?
Probably.
With Richard Harris.
Okay, yeah, having a play or a drama, that's important and tied to this. And so the idea of Camelot is very important in occultism. And so from what I understand, Camelot was given after he died. I think Jackie Kennedy supposedly, referred to, Kennedy's presidency as Camelot or something like that. So that's kind of where it came from. And then you think about Kennedy's, I found some magazine, they called them America's royal family, right? So they're like the royalty, they're regal in the United States. So they're kind of like, the British royal family of the United States, but supposedly that they're not monarchs, right? Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is, I don't know how valid this story is, but people always talk about it. The little girl who did like a genealogical research and says that all the presidents except for like one or two are tied to the Plantagenet line. Whether that's true or not, the mainstream news has reported it. Mm-hmm. So it's out there in the consciousness of everything that the president's tied back to the Plantagenet. So if that is true, or if people believe that to be true, then that means that JFK ties back to that. And so this is very interesting when you get into the roots of Camelot. And so basically, Manly Palmer Hall and this occult writer named Hargrave Jennings, he wrote this book called The Rosicrucians. They have a lot to say about this Camelot connection. So I have some source reading in my series, and I'll just summarize it here. But basically, the Arthurian legend, according to them, is Gnostic Christian. A lot of people will tie the Arthurian legends to Catholicism, and this is, again, where interpretation might come into play. And this is all idealized in the figure of Henry VIII. And Henry VIII, there's a depiction of him at this round table in, I think it's Winchester Castle. I'll have to double check on that. But so he's like in the King Arthur seat. He's the Camelot figure on the round table. And so what's important about Henry VIII, he was the unification of bloodlines, the child of the houses of York and Lancaster of the Plantagenets. And so this is the Tudor rose, the red and the white rose combined together. And this ties into Rosicrucianism. And basically, this author, Hargrave Jennings, says this Camelot mythology is Kabbalistic in the highest degree. So there's super deep esoteric meaning in all of this. And there's some connections to like the Templars and the Knights of Malta and stuff like that, again, from the viewpoint of the occultist. So you think about this, you're connecting the alleged Plantagenet president back to this king that was a unification of those lines. And what's important about Henry VIII, he was the one who said F you to the Pope and got his divorce, right?
Yeah.
So there's another Catholic breakdown of an empire, or at least like one of the main events that's seen as, you know, dividing it. So I think that that's pretty interesting already, connecting Camelot from the occult viewpoint back to him and the Tudor and all these sorts of things. And then I'll let you get a word in here, but I'll just finish up at saying that Manly Palmer Hall relates all of this Round Table Camelot stuff to the Gnostics, the Essenes, the Johannites, the Templars, the Rosicrucians. And this is also connected to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, Apollo, Osiris, Mithras, Prometheus, Jupiter, all of those solar saviors and, you know, occultism. And the whole point of this is to connect it with death and rebirth of being born again of the spirit. So this death and rebirth and being born again in occultism is just like the bread and butter of all of their rituals and their alchemy. I don't know if you have anything to respond about that, or I'll keep going, whatever.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, and so, you know, there's this important connection there. And so the idea of Kennedy being a Catholic background, that would tie into this alchemical transmutation and taking it away from that traditional Catholic empire and then putting the, well, I guess the Masonic United States first, or way back when, you know, the will of King Henry VIII. So it's kind of funny that in the occult doctrines, they always are bashing materialism, excessive indulgences of the flesh and stuff like that. But King Henry VIII apparently was like, you know, from what I understand, like a big indulger in eating, obviously women, maybe perhaps a drunk. So why is he so revered when all of that is condemned in occultism? So is this kind of like a hypocrisy, a duality? I don't know.
Yeah.
So anyways, and then the last thing I'll mention about this is if you read books like The Golden Bough, I've never read the whole thing because it's a long book and it's kind of boring in my opinion, but this is by Sir James Fraser, and he's sort of like revered in a lot of occult circles, and it's all about, you know, anthropology and ancient customs and tying them together. But one of the most important things is the killing of the king. And this goes back to Egypt, where the king is Horus, he's killed, becomes Osiris, and this is for the good of the people, for the fertility of the land. You're killing an old, weak king to rebirth through the sun and a new light. So there you go. This all stems back to ancient, you know, mystery religion kind of stuff. And so the king is an incarnation of the sun or the lunar god, and, you know, he's playing out this role. So that's kind of all the Camelot breakdowns that go back to occultism. So I think it's pretty interesting that of all the people, all the presidents we've ever had, Kennedy was the one that was most portrayed as a king, and they tied Camelot in there. And so, you know, coincidence? I don't know.
Yeah, and also they put him up on a pedestal. I guess he was the first, you know, television president, telegenic, of course. You know, you have the televised debates with Nixon, and I guess he was the first president that was elected via television. At least that's what they say. And glamorous, you know, with his young wife, and then to have him, you know, have him taken out with his head being blown off. Just the traumatic effect of that on the public. The chemical effect it would have, perhaps on the entire decade. I think it was Michael Hoffman in the book Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare says the 60s began with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The fundamental transformation in American society right after Kennedy's death is undeniable. You know, from the fashion to the music, cacophonous rock music took over and these things. And so basically you had a sort of a debasing alchemical effect on the culture. And that's sort of that bloodletting, that trauma would facilitate something like the Vietnam War, which is sort of a big bloodletting trauma that would allow for a lot of the changes that occurred in the 1960s. You couldn't have had some of the dramatic changes in the culture without the trauma of the assassinations Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, also you also have Martin Luther King, and these things. And I mean, yeah,
And there's another killing of the king.
yeah, exactly, killing the king. And you can say, I mean, obviously you can point the obvious motivations behind the assassinations were, you can see, taking out an inconvenient man. But the alchemical effect is obviously the trauma that it creates for the culture, that the bloodletting creates, the bloodletting of culture, where society just seems to be kind of, spiraling out of control. And you really couldn't have had the counterculture movement, nor could you have had the youth movement. You had demographics played a big part in that, but that was driven by things like mass media and the war itself. And that's how you got so many young people mobilized, or at least feeling that they had to go out and protest in the streets and rebel against, their parents' generation. Was by the wider societal environment that was created by the establishment. So
Yeah, and the trauma stuff is really important to all of this alchemical ritual. It's called the Negredo, or the blackening in alchemy, and I'll get into that in a bit. But I just wanted to talk about the idea of Dealey Plaza being a reflection of a Masonic temple and also the Kabbalistic tree of life. It was built to mimic that, and I'm just going to go over some of the correlations there. But first off, the idea of the twin pillars, obviously, Jacqueline and Boaz, that's very important in Masonic ritual. And there's a hidden middle pillar that is the equilibrium of the two, and that's what's hidden, and that's what the adepts know about. So the public sees it as black and white, dualistic, and you could say now church and state separate. That's how people see it. But I think that there's a hidden esoteric middle pillar that's completely in line with combining the occult religion with the state. And so if you think about, Manly Palmer Hall talks about this idea of the twin pillars, and they can be towers. So obviously the twin towers and the whole destruction of them, and that's a whole other Masonic ritual tied to it. But it has a lot of the similar parallels to this outside of the whole king aspect. But so these two pillars are like the salt and the sulfur of alchemy. The mercury is what binds them in the middle. And this leads to the door of the house of God. And this can be associated with like the womb, or the door of the womb. And this is why they put the high priestess in between the pillars. She's the equilibrium of the two. And this is for illumination. So when you saw the Statue of Liberty, there's a lot of famous pictures of her in between the twin towers. That's like an esoteric invocation of the high priestess card in tarot. And so this is built in to Dealey Plaza, and basically I'll explain this, where if you look at the overlay of Dealey Plaza back in 1963, now some of the streets have been blocked off with buildings, but there's a plaque where you can see all the roads, and there's sort of like this square pattern. And I invite anybody to look at my series or some of the slides to follow along with this in case they're confused, because it's hard to explain without the visuals. But basically, the three pillars in Kabbalah are the north pillar of severity or destruction, the south pillar of mercy, creation, and then there's a middle pillar of harmony or equilibrium. And so the north pillar is related to Elm Street. That's why when they have Nightmare on Elm Street, the pillar of severity, destruction. And then the middle pillar is the equilibrium of the two, that's Main Street. And then commerce would be the south pillar. And if you apply the idea of a north and a south to the middle pillar being the split of them, what's very interesting is that Main Street, the middle pillar, splits the north and south of the horizontal street. So what I mean by that is that North Houston Street is split by Main Street into South Houston Street and North Record Street, and then there's a South Record Street, North Market Street, South Record Street. So that middle pillar that splits the Masonic pillars of the north and the south, the streets do the same thing. So it's pretty obvious that they're alluding to the Masonic pillars here, with the north and south union right at Main Street. And basically the Daily Plaza, you can see this triple pillar design of the overlay built into the old Twin Towers. There's like a trident that goes up each of the Twin Towers. And so the Twin Towers are the two pillars. There was a hidden middle pillar in the Twin Towers, and it's kind of complicated. They did a talk on the Sage of Quay about the 9/11 ritual, so people are interested, they can go to that. But so these are all connected in symbology. And so the way this relates to a Masonic temple is that the directions are very important, north, south, east, and west. And so the actual layout of the plaza mimics this. So if the motorcade of JFK started, it started in the east. So this is seen as the heavens, you know, like the sun rising, the east. This is like the highest point of what's called the Kabbalistic tree of life in Kabbalah. And then the west is earth. This is representative of the realm of duality, man's dualistic nature. And then the north and the south pillar, obviously those are the north and south directions.
Und das ist das Geile. Er fährt im Süden los, an der höchsten Form, dann biegt er nach Westen ab, kommt auf die Erde und dann biegt das Auto nach Norden ab, damit sein eigenes Licht ausgeht. Und dann wird er erst erschossen. Es ist so brachial, verrückt. Er musste auf der westlichen Hemisphäre Blickrichtung Tempel sterben, bei Sonnenuntergang. An der richtigen Stelle, in der richtigen Entfernung, im Einklang mit dem Universum. Das ist schon krass.
And so you can see that Daily Plaza is laid out this way, where Elm Street is in the north, Commerce Street's in the south, and then where the three pillars merge into one, that's in the west, and that corresponds to where they merge on the Tree of Life. So people should Google the Tree of Life Kabbalah, or they should just go through some of the beginnings of my series, and you'll be able to see all of this corresponding. And so essentially, what you have is, again, I don't want to get too complicated because this all this in-depth Kabbalah, but every single pathway on this Tree of Life has specific tarot cards that correspond to them, and they're given specific zodiac signs or planets. And so the point is that the pathways that the motorcade went on have extreme Kabbalistic significance, and they can be sort of summarized in tarot cards. So it's kind of ominous, but when JFK's limo is turning onto North Houston, they're going to the direction of darkness, the pillar of severity, right? And the tarot card that corresponds to that is the Tower. And the Tower is the king and queen being dethroned with the crown shot off. And then he was assassinated in what's called the Path of Judgment. And the Judgment card is about death and resurrection. And so it's pretty ominous that JFK was assassinated on the pathway corresponding to judgment in Kabbalah. So this is all very deeply Kabbalistic, and there's a lot of numbers that correspond to that, but I won't really get into the depths. It can be a little bit complex. But the point is that, this is all, the pathway is very ritualistically planned. And then Daily Plaza itself has two twin obelisks in it, or it used to. It was designed that way, and they replaced one with a George Daly statue. And there's an interesting book that it's just called Daily Plaza Images of America, that has a lot of history on it, and I found it very revealing to kind of correspond to a lot of these things. So the two pillars, they built the obelisk in 14 sections. So Osiris was supposedly cut up into 14 pieces, and they placed an eternal flame on the top of these obelisks. So that's like the eternal flame lighting of JFK's ceremony at the funeral. And all the numbers that are built into this correspond to Kabbalistic numbers that are associated with the active male force, which is what Osiris is. And again, this is like deeper Kabbalah, but it's just very interesting that all of the numbers correspond to, the male phallic nature built into these obelisks. And so, you have the twin pillars there, the obelisk, and then you have reflecting pools. So you have the passive expression there that are reflecting the obelisk or the George Daly statue. So that's sort of like the feminine expression reflecting Osiris. So this is all built into Daily Plaza, and I think that if people can
So, ich werde es an der Stelle erstmal, reicht für heute, für den Augenblick. Das Thema ist echt faszinierend. Ich werde das jetzt wahrscheinlich am Wochenende in Karlsruhe mal präsentieren. Die Akte Dallas von Arkansas und Little Rock zur Museumsbüchothek. Also es ist so verrückt und krass. Mal gucken, ob ich das alles noch fertig kriege oder ob ich bloß aus dem Vorgeschmack mache. Aber für euch reicht es erstmal an der Stelle. Und check raus und auf die D-Live. Bis später.